Hello, everyone. I'm Father Armando El-Khouri, the Vice Rector of the Maronite Seminary in Washington, D.C. In the name of Monsignor ŁΠIETR, the Rector of the Seminary, I greet and welcome all of you to the online Maronite Enrichment Days, sponsored by the Maronite Seminary in Washington, D.C. This event, the Maronite Enrichment Days, should have taken place in person back in April, but the Maronite Seminary had to cancel all its events due to the corona pandemic. I'm thankful to our speaker, Dr. ŒNRICHMENT, who agreed to hold these online talks on the Book of Steps from his home in Canada. Dr. ÉNRICHMENT became attracted to Syriac theology after reading The Wisdom of the Desert, Sayings from the Desert Fathers of the 4th Century by Thomas Merton. This new attraction led him to become a world-renowned scholar in Syriac studies. Dr. ÉNRICHMENT began reading the Book of Steps in 1974 with Professor Father Alexander de Lilla in the Semitics Department of the Catholic University of America. Dr. ÉNRICHMENT earned a BA from Springfield College in Massachusetts, an MDiv from the Pacific School of Religion in California in 1974, an MA in Syriac from the Catholic University of America in 1978, and a doctor in philosophy from the University of Oxford in 1998. At Oxford, Dr. ÉNRICHMENT studied under the famous Sebastian Brock. Dr. ÉNRICHMENT is a retired United Church of Christ and United Church of Canada minister, serving for 43 years in Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Saskatchewan until 2016. He is a senior lecturer in Syriac patristics, St. Ignatius Theological Academy, Södertälje, Sweden, and visiting professor in Syriac New Testament exegesis, MA in Syriac Theology program, University of Salzburg, Austria. He has translated the Book of Steps and the Discourses of Philoxenus of Mabuk, both for Cistercian publications. He and his wife, the Reverend Mary Ellen McGreal-Kitchen, reside in Regina, Saskatchewan. They have 3 children. Dr. Kitchen is a native of Baltimore, a fan of the Orioles and Saskatchewan Roughriders. Without further ado, let's give a warm online welcome to Dr. Robert Kitchen.
Hey, let's start with a big observation. In all of Christian literature, few books even come close to rivaling the 4th century, the Book of Steps, ŒNRICHMENT de Moscoto. Not in its theology per se, which is far from insignificant, but in the way it describes the development over time of an early Christian community, its ideals, its successes, and the candid admittance of failure and decline. I may be mistaken, but I have not heard of a Greek, Latin, or Syriac text that gives us this kind of story. The central characteristic for understanding this large book is its lack of pretension. The author did not self-consciously keep a diary for future generations. This is a compilation of his writings, guidelines, rules, sermons, perhaps put together by a disciple. But besides this, it is not written in a clear chronological narrative as we're used to reading theological texts. The Book of Steps is also not a small book, 362 pages in the translation. So I think an overview, a big picture is necessary to be able to see the forest from the trees. Because actually, as I worked on this book, there are no chapters, Nimre, where the author tells you exactly what, everything you need to know. It's here, there, and everywhere throughout the book. Again, because he's not intending to write something systematic. So I will be referring to a number of things several times throughout throughout this talk in order to give us a fuller idea of how he worked and what his image and imagination was. Okay, the Book of Steps has been hiding out in full view now for nearly 100 years. A critical edition of the Syriac text from 15 manuscripts was compiled, accompanied by a Latin translation by ŁΠΑΙ, and published as the third and last volume in the Patrologia Syriaca series in 1926. Now that series also includes the principal edition that we use today for the demonstrations of Afrahat. Scholarly tomes such as these back then were always introduced and translated into Latin. So the name of this work, therefore, was Latinized, Liber Graduum, and for many scholars that is still its most recognizable name. So when I was serving in my first Protestant pastorate in Maryland after seminary, I was in a four-church circuit, Methodist circuit surrounding Frostburg, Maryland. I studied Syriac and Coptic in the Semitics department of the Catholic University of America in DC. And it has made comments in my second year. Father Alexander Delella introduced me to snippets of Syriac, different Syriac texts, partly to experience the breadth of the literature and to see if any particular work captured my attention. There were two that did. One was the discourses of Philoxenus of Marburg, and the other, this Liber Graduum. Now, frankly, I have no memories of my first readings and why they captured my attention, but eventually I would write an MA thesis on the just or the upright, the kine, and the perfect, gemire, in both works. Philoxenus at that point tended to be my focal point. But after a while, I put Philoxenus aside and focused on the Book of Steps. I wrote a couple articles, and as again, Father Armando has noted, I finally did my DPhil dissertation at Oxford on these same two works. I examined in them the development of perfection, gemiruto, and in other Syriac works. In the late 1990s, this is the interesting point about the way the study of this book went. I was able to read everything published about the Book of Steps, except for a couple of articles in Polish, for which fortunately Sebastian Brock gave me a pass. It has always been called a book, but as noted above, it was not written with that intention. The Book of Steps contains 30 prose memrae of varying lengths, plus an introductory mamulo, a kind of preface, written reputedly, at least is identifies himself as a later editor who praises the anonymous author as one who did not want to make known his name. Now, we never do hear the author's name. This is indeed an intentionally anonymous work, and he takes anonymity seriously. Throughout this lengthy volume, the author mentions the conflict between Persia and Rome once, in the briefest of ways, the Euphrates River once, and in the 30th and last memro, he uses as an illustration the Lesser Zab River, which is a river that flows southeasterly in northeastern Iraq, more or less equidistant between Erbil and Kirkuk. So the author's faith community is based, we assume, in a town or a village in this region. The different levels of this church, the upright, the perfect, those who are lower than the upright, and those who have indeed reached beyond perfection. He talks about all of these in one fashion or another. They lived together. Classic monasticism had not yet reached this area. And indeed, from what we know of the development of early monasticism, it usually began on the edges of a town or a village. And it was much later when it started to move and be fully isolated. So while the perfect, that we'll hear more about, exhibit characteristics later identified as monastic, they were well known by the less elite, both in the church and in their community. Two more aspects of anonymity color the pages of the Book of Steps. This is going to sound odd at first. First, there are no people mentioned in the Book of Steps. That is, there are no contemporary or historical figures. No kings or rulers are noted. The only people, and of course they're important, that are mentioned are biblical characters. And second, there are no dates or outside events are mentioned, which of course has thwarted the attempts of scholars to contextualize this work. An unsure consensus by many scholars has been that this was written somewhere in the last quarter of the 4th century, so 375 or so. Some scholars suggested that the author wrote during or after the terrible and violent persecutions of Christians by the Shah Shapur II, who reigned from 340 to 372. And others opt for a later period in the same century, when the memory of the persecutions was still vivid, but circumstances had normalized to some degree. Kyle Smith has suggested a much later dating to the 430s into the next century, in that the Book of Steps he saw to be a response to the legislation of ŒRICHMENT, who was writing rules for the early monks. Father René Roux has argued for a much earlier date, going the opposite direction, in the early 4th century, so barely in the very early 300s, responding to the persistence of a Marcionistic rejection of the Old Testament. Both theories have merit, but I think I'm leaning in the direction of Father Roux's conclusions, because they seem to fit the nature of the Book of Steps more precisely. However, neither consensus has generated much discussion yet, so that's still waiting for other people to look at. The book is anonymous, but the author nevertheless writes a tremendous amount. So what's the Book of Steps about? And I hope some of you are at least familiar in general, but we'll give an idea of how he operated. The author, you see, has an inspired imagination of how the church should function as the incarnation of Christ with its members. Biblical theology is fundamental, but how the Christians in the church are organized and ranked are the initial steps in his writing, how he structures the church. And he structures it into two major groups: the upright or the just, as I mentioned before, the kine, and the perfect, the gemire. Now, today we would call the upright the laity, because, and he's quite clear about this, they can be married, own property, work at jobs, practice this, but they also practice the various aspects of charity, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and the imprisoned. The perfect, on the other hand, are frequently depicted as a much higher group from the upright. And they have some fairly stringent requirements. They are pledged to celibacy. They do not own property or a home. They don't even have a place to stay that they can call their own. And they pointedly do not work. One of the duties, or one duty of the upright, mentioned only a couple brief times, is that they are, it's their job to provide the basic needs, especially food, to the perfect. Both levels are treated implicitly as distinctive and special within this, this community of the Book of Steps. You could say they're consecrated members of the church, although there are no references to a liturgical consecration of either group. Nor is it ever clear how the two levels are chosen or sorted out. They just simply appear, and he deals with them. On the one hand, we get the sense at points that individuals self-identify or choose which direction to go. I'm going to stay as an upright, or I'm going to become perfect. And then they're given detailed instructions on what the standards are for their behavior in several of his mimre. It does not appear, however, that the author selected specific individuals in that he knew their own way of life, and that's what qualified them for either group. The author, I don't think, could make or appoint a perfect, although he does encourage or chastise many depending upon their subsequent behavior. In the later mimre, in the latter days of the Book of Steps, we could say, the author admits the failure of many perfect, some of whom have even fallen below uprightness. They are no longer part of this consecrated status altogether. If the author had been initially involved in selecting who would belong to the perfect, well, I think we could judge him a little bit harshly and say that he was a poor judge of their character and potential. But the most critical evaluation of the Book of Steps is that it is not the external experience and qualities that allow a certain person to attain perfection, but his persistence and endurance and faithfulness over the long haul. The author does not utilize special hierarchical language with which we are familiar. There are leaders, but he does not use the term bishop. The author emphatically, in fact, declares that such leaders can never be perfect because they have to use sometimes corporal punishment or other forms of perhaps even violence in order to carry out their laws and regulations. The upright appear to be the forerunners, however, or parallel of the diaconate. They are centered on serving the needs of others. The perfect, particularly in the unusual assignment not to work, are intended to be an eschatological rehearsal of those re-entering the Garden of Eden, in which Adam and Eve, as you remember from Genesis, did not know what sexuality was. Remember the phrase, they did not know that they were naked, and they did not work. The perfect, therefore, are attempting to live the original life of salvation, the way it was meant to be. Only now they're trying to do it in this world. Many, it is safe to say, were not able to retain or remain perfect throughout the period of the Book of Steps. The author's writings are diverse. We have these 30 mimre, but they're composed in a variety of literary genres, but they are not random, since in most instances he is responding to the circumstances surrounding and confronting him in the church community. One important feature is that he uses biblical language and imagery on virtually every occasion. The Bible provides his vocabulary as well as his perception of the manner in which the world functions and how it should operate. Indeed, when you get down to counting them, there's over 1,200 biblical citations given throughout the Book of Steps, 2 or 3 on every page. But unlike some ancient and modern theologians, he does not use very many one-verse citations, those proof texts that are often employed outside of their original context. A significant portion of his biblical usage is by means of extended biblical narratives. He's often giving us a longer midrashic retelling of a familiar story or parable. On some occasions, in order to undergird the upright and the perfect stratification of the Christian life. The first third of the Mimre are generally the rules of the community. He presents the qualifications and the duties of the upright and the perfect, and these will be reiterated in several places in later Mimre as well, in order, I think, to keep reminding the two groups of their vocation and of their responsibilities. But until the last 6 Mimres, till we get into Mimro 25, there is a clear stratification between the upright and the perfect. The perfect are the residents of what was called by C.H. Dodd a generation ago when he was interpreting the Gospel of John. They're residents of the realized eschaton. In other words, they're living in the way it is meant to be in the kingdom of heaven right now. The upright, however, at least in his earlier descriptions, they're good people, but they're always lacking. They're always inferior. They're being, especially when you compare them to the heights of the perfect. The author's method is to describe the responsibilities and the tasks of the upright quantitatively. For instance, they pray 3 times a day. The perfect are beyond any numbers. They pray unceasingly all day. The upright are limited by being bound to this earthly life, by marriage, by the worry of possessions, and the perfect, they have no worries, they have no limits to what they can accomplish, no boundaries, and so they reflect living in the divine character of the Garden of Eden, to which they have now re-entered. Other Mimre illustrate the theological and biblical rationales for this structured way of life. There are 3 sermons in the Book of Steps which the author delivered. They respond critically, usually, to how the perfect were not carrying out their vocation. The one interesting thing is that if you look back over all of the Mimre, the author really never criticizes the upright, but he does criticize the perfect. These sermons, by the way, are the only ones that do not really talk about the upright or perfect at all. The author writes several Mimre responding to challenges to him and the community regarding theological issues. One of them, for instance, is the big question in Mimro 15 of sexuality and celibacy. Why do you need to be celibate? Which was probably not a normal practice then. And externally, he's responding in Mimro 9, someone raised the issue of all the Old Testament prophets who did terrible things at God's command, and yet, as the author carries them through the argument, they were received into the kingdom of heaven at the last days after the apostles. Okay, I've gone around and around. Who are the upright and the perfect? I guess the question for each of us is, could you and I qualify now? The author of the Book of Steps does not insist that an upright, a Ľīνος, must be married and have children, own property and home, and have money and work at a job. This is just, of course, the way ordinary people live in the church and community. But the Ľīνοι, however, have not renounced anything from the world. And that's part of the division. It is only with the perfect that one is required to renounce the world and its possessions. The perfect then must not own any property, nor have a home, have a job, or even to work, and are to be celibate, so no wife. There is, by the way, never a mention. This is curious, but I guess not to be unexpected in this kind of literature and day and age. There's never a mention of a female perfect. What would be a บํήρτος, or even a female upright, a ĺīνtos. Although to be honest with you, I cannot imagine that women were not significantly involved in feeding, clothing, and welcoming those who are poor and without resources, ensuring that things really did work. But consequently, the perfect ones must wander around homeless. They need to depend, and this is quite intentional in the author's conception of them. They're dependent upon the generosity and the care of others to survive the conditions of life and to be able to eat and drink adequately. Theirs is a life of continual prayer and then of teaching the spiritual wisdom they have acquired. And there are a couple mentions that on some occasions, they actually go and mediate conflicts in other towns and villages. And they do this because in the other towns and villages, they are strangers and therefore considered to be neutral. They have renounced the world, and that includes partiality and prejudice towards human debates and conflicts. The upright, instead of renouncing possessions that incite envy and covetousness, use these possessions by giving some of them away to others who are in need. The upright person, they mention, can be engaged in trade and business, but he is only allowed to claim his or her fair measure, no interest. Even if it takes, in one of his phrases, even if it takes 100 years for him to be repaid. The upright life is not cunning or manipulative. There's no stealing, cheating, and yet, yes or no to a question, as Jesus said, no revenge. And if something is stolen from him, all he can expect to take back is the original item. The upright one does not insult or call someone a fool or some other derogatory name. He simply calls him by his regular Christian name. Religious duties are confined for the upright. Again, this is a little more specific. They're to pray 3 times a day, to keep the law of God, to give alms and pray for others. It may not sound too strenuous, but we'll see in the long run that this good, ordinary life can yield extraordinary benefits and virtues. I'm just going to go aside for a second to give several notes on how to place the study of the Book of Steps into full perspective. It has been called the Book of Steps for quite some time, in Latin and in English, and even in several of the older manuscripts we find the term used. But in today's parlance, however, that title could be confused with one of the so-called 12-step manuals, but it is not. The term steps, maskoto, is used only in 2 of the Mimre, numbers 19 and 20. And it's not used anywhere else as a recurring theme or motif. And yet, as we're going to now explain, steps are not irrelevant to the trajectory, the narrative that the author presents. In the 19th and 20th Mimre, the author creates this picture, a parable, you might say, for the reader and for his congregation. There is a road ascending upwards towards the city of God, the city, indeed the city of our Lord Jesus, on which one who wishes to become a solitary needs to climb. Now, it's right here that the author introduces this term solitary, Ľidoio. It's an important term, and becomes even more important after the Book of Steps, an important term in Syriac asceticism and monasticism. It's been translated in various ways, but I think the best one has been Sidney Griffith's rendering of the term as the single one. That's the simplest, the best place to begin. Then there are other connotations, and the most important connotation is in Syriac is Ľidoio is the only begotten one, Jesus Christ. Griffith suggests that this image of the only begotten one is an original double entendre of the text. So, in other words, a monk is or follower is an Ľidoio, someone who is modeling his life after the only begotten one. Eventually, Ľidoio became identified just in a generic way with monks. Monks, if you remember, evolves out of the Greek word one or single one. And so they are literally solitaries, but not all monks, as we know, would be solitaries alone in the wilderness for Cenobitic monasticism emerged. Okay, back to the would-be solitary or single one at the foot of the long, steep, narrow, and difficult road rising to the city of our Lord Jesus Christ. The road is straight and narrow, and that is the perfect road. But the author recognizes that not everyone can endure the strenuousness of the climb. So alongside the road, he talks about the fact that there are roads or paths, shabile, that veer off from this high, steep road. They're more gentle, they're easier to negotiate. These are the upright paths. The problem is, in the Book of Steps author's view, is that once leaving the perfect road, one cannot get back onto it and continue one's ascent. This implies the formidable decision, indeed, that one must make at the beginning of one's spiritual journey, whether to be perfect or upright. In the majority of the Book of Steps, one can fall from the pursuit of perfection, but one cannot progress from uprightness to perfection until we get to the very end of the Book of Steps. And there it appears that the author has changed his understanding of spiritual development, although he does not ever announce the fact that he has changed his ideas. The upright are tacitly allowed to graduate to the pursuit and climb to perfection. As one climbs higher on the perfect road, the road he continues to describe, especially as he gets into the 20th memro, the road becomes steeper, and no one, no matter how good you are, can avoid its difficulty. The 20th memra continues this motif, and it declares that the last 3 steps are the most difficult. Many, in fact, cringe at these final steps. They stop and they go back, he claims. These 3 are: 1, making amends directly and personally with all one's enemies. 2nd, completely relinquishing any form of work to provide for one's needs in order to divest oneself from all that he has and, of course, create utter dependence upon others. And 3, the most difficult one, is to get rid of the sin of Adam and Eve, which means, among other things, confronting murder and blood and perhaps martyrdom. I'll talk about this more, but on another day. In the last 5 to 6 memrae, the author finds himself not really changing his mind about the upright and perfect, but realizing that Christian spiritual development works differently than he had originally thought and theorized. Painfully, he sees that the perfect have tired of the discipline. They're looking for shortcuts which result in undermining their spiritual progress. And in the last 3 memrae, there is barely a mention of the perfect at all. And you even wonder whether there are any of them left. The author, however, recognizes now the spiritual growth of the upright. They have been assisting all sorts of people, including the perfect, worshiping and praying ardently along the way. Some of the upright have been transformed into what the author thought this perfect spiritually would be. So several times he urges them to become celibate and literally uses the phrase, keep going, you're almost there, you're almost perfect. But there's no report on whether many of them took him up on that. This is, again, one of the uniquenesses of the Book of Steps, in which I don't think there is any other book maybe in all of Christian literature where there are several levels. A lot of books deal with a higher and a lower level of the Christian life, in which the lower level eventually supersedes the higher level. The 30th memro witnesses a range of conflicts. Talks about the upright, the perfect, the secular sides. They're all called out in one way or the other for their ignominious conduct. But at the very end of the 30th memro, the author reinterprets the story of Zacchaeus' encounter with Jesus as a definite indication that the upright may retain their possessions and money and still be capable of salvation. And it is notable here that he says absolutely nothing about the perfect. And then, a couple paragraphs later, the Book of Steps ends, virtually in mid-sentence. There's no real concluding argument. We hear nothing about the author and his community, although other Syriac authors will witness to the continued existence of the upright and the perfect, only differently. Philoxenus of Marburg, various Syriac church councils refer to the upright and particularly to the perfect in their synods. The East Syriac Paradise of the Fathers, which collects all the Desert Father stories together, and its principal commentator, jourdișocă, all show us that the perfect and the upright continue to be part of the fabric of the church. But unfortunately, they never really tell us enough, or they don't tell us it in a systematic enough way. Anonymity, after all, has its price to pay. So the anonymity of the author and of his long, rambling corpus of rules, theology, and sermons, his defenses of controversial issues, I think is grounded in one quiet, silent quality, and that is humility, ŁΠΑΚΙΚOΥΤΟ, absolute humility, by which one needs not to make known his name. Thank you very much. That's open to any questions or thoughts or from here.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yep, I'm finished.
Dr. Kitchen, thank you so much for your work and for meeting with us today. I just had a quick question for you regarding the kind of dating and interaction of the Book of Steps with some of the other documents from that era. So I'm thinking specifically of the Apostolic Constitutions and the Didascalia Apostolorum. Has there been any attempts to put them side by side as they can all be placed to Greater Syria from the 3rd or 4th century?
Not really, no. It tends to be part of a, the Apostolic Constitution tends, I think, to be part of someone, of early church documents that somehow has not made the connection to the Book of Steps. One of the problems with the Book of Steps, I think, throughout the years, is that it is just that it has been ignored. I'd say it's been out there in plain view, and it was one of the reasons, after the publication of the Book of Steps, the translation of it, which was the first modern language version. Christian Heel, who was a classmate of mine at Oxford, and I got together and we organized a volume of essays on the Book of Steps. And we had about 16 essays, called it The Breaking of the Mind, the new essays in the Syriac Book of Steps, published by Catholic University of America Press. And however, it's interesting, now that you bring it, that did not, the Apostolic Constitution, no one really touched that. And so, but it would make something worth looking at and seeing if there is some connection.
Hi, Doctor. I have a question. All right. You have mentioned that there are 3 sermons which the author delivered, right, in the Book of Steps. So what was the actual settings and what was the motive for these sermons and to whom those were given? Was that mentioned anywhere in the book? And what's the purpose?
Yeah, this is one of the problems. When I say that there are 3 sermons, it is really from my analysis, because they stick out. One in which they do not, this was after the fact. The format of them certainly implied that they were, that he was preaching, or at least giving they were in the chapel somewhere and he was obviously talking to them, quite seriously about some issues. But then as I looked back at the 3, it's number 10, number 25, and number 29. You see that he does not, for those 3, does not deal with the upright and the perfect. One of the problems with the Book of Steps, again, they say the anonymity of it really covers everything. So we have no idea, except through the hints in his writing, where these took place. The audience in this particular case, in these three sermons, if you will, seem to be the perfect. I'm assuming that because it was a community, there were probably the upright, there were probably the people who were good members of the church, but they hadn't signed on to do all the works of charity. They were probably present too, but he's only really talking to the perfect in a critical way, in which he's pointing out how they have lost track of what their way of life is meant to be. So yeah, this is one of our biggest problems with trying to deal with it, and with the Book of Steps, is its lack of context. And we take an awful lot from, like, say, that one reference to the Lesser Zab River, and we go to town with that one, trying to to locate where it was. Wish I could give a more specific answer.
Thanks.
I have a quick question. Dr. Kitchen, good to see you again. Two questions, actually. The first one is, you talk about the upright, well, the author speaks about the upright, and he gives the biblical Zacchaeus as the typology, if I dare use that word, right?
Yeah.
For the perfect, is Jesus, for example, and is it explicit as it was in Zacchaeus? Who's the typology?
I'd say that two ways. One, yeah, Jesus is the model, but it is not, it's not really as specific as that. And indeed, with the upright, he's not so much identifying Zacchaeus as the model for everybody. It's the fact that Zacchaeus, in fact, this may be the worst case model. Zacchaeus is someone that everybody recognizes probably cheated everybody out of all their money, used high pressure techniques, and then he wants to see Jesus. Jesus says, and then he tells him, "Look, I'm going to give away half of my money only, half only," he says. In other words, I'm not going to give up all my money. I'm going to give up 50%, not 49, not 51. I'm going to give up 50%. And Jesus says, maybe in our way of saying it, that's enough. You're saved. I'm going to your house, and you're doing. So it's an example. You might say the worst case example. In fact, he actually continues and says, if you gave 75%, he doesn't use that term, but if he says, if you give 75% of your money and possessions away, you're even better than Zacchaeus. So the person that he uses, perhaps again more as a good model, is Abraham, because Abraham had he had lots of wives, he had lots of cattle and property, and yet he was considered just by God, and did a lot of good with his money and with his property, and that's what the upright can do.
And the second question I have has to do with, and if you're going to cover it in the next subsequent conferences, that's fine. The children and the sick, and what's their relationship with the upright and with the perfect?
Okay, he uses several, and again, it didn't. There's too many categories that he develops. He talks about when one begins as a Christian, that there are several stages that one pretty much naturally has to go through. And like children and those who are sick, you cannot give them the full, the full dosage right away. So you have to, children at first have to drink milk, and the sick can only eat vegetables rather than in both groups eat eat meat. So it's there are differences. So even the upright themselves that he is praising are at a higher level than these other groups. And so he has a lot of different distinctions, but this is part of what I think happened. I think he, in the very beginning, and maybe I need to go back a slight bit here. The Book of Steps, one of the things we are always puzzled about is, are these written in chronological order? And we have no way of particularly judging it. But it does appear that in the beginning he's giving the rules. You know, he has this imagination, this conception of the way Christian life should be that has been informed by his interpretation of Scripture, and so he is so that's what he's trying to give, and so yeah, he's one just kind of keeps working their way up, in the spiritual life, but there's all these other intermediate levels. But I think at the end, he has, without announcing it, because he stops talking about the perfect and he starts talking more and more directly to the upright, which he had seldom done before, encouraging them. I think he has realized that the upright have developed spiritually in ways he did not initially imagine they could. And so that's why Abraham and then Zacchaeus get thrown into the picture at the end. Okay.
Dr. Kitchen, I don't know if you're going to get to this also, but was wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about the author's eschatological outlook, because in some of the passages, it's mostly in his Mimra on Adam's marital desire, but there's kind of other passages peppered throughout where he says that he talks about how only the perfect will enter the bridal chamber, and that he also alludes to, like, there's a Gehenna, but then there's a place for the perfect, and there's all these places in between. And kind of today we kind of understand that, like, everyone who will die in a state of grace will get the beatific vision if they go through some purging. But he seems to say that only the perfect will get to see Christ face to face. So can you maybe talk a little bit about what his outlook on that was?
Yeah, I think that is that's pretty much what he's, that's the 15th Mimro, so right in the middle. And again, we have no idea in terms of time, how many years in between, these different things, these different Mimre. Certainly, yeah, that was what the way he thought it would work, is that, if you're going to go back to the Garden of Eden, you're going to re-enter, which was in fact a persistent idea of early Syriac Christianity. Yes, there is the kingdom of heaven. The language is used for both terms, but instead of going, to use the spatial things, instead of going up to the kingdom of heaven, Syriac Christianity preferred the idea of returning to the Garden of Eden, and their sexuality was not an issue, and so the only way you can approximate that is by being celibate. I think what the story is here, yes, at that point, he was still firmly convinced that this is the way things should be. He is being challenged. We can get from a number of little statements in the 15th Mimro about sexuality and celibacy. He is being challenged by somebody some buddies, why be celibate? Isn't that unnatural or something along those lines? But I think later on, as we get into number 25, 26, and beyond, then if this indeed is chronological, he has started to understand. He's seen how the perfect have all sorts of problems. Part of it is one of their biggest problems is pride. They know they're number one, and and that, of course, gets in the way of who they are and what their ministry is to be. The upright never had that problem. They always know they're number two. I guess they're Hertz or something like that. And so it's, or is that Avis? I can't remember now. So he's I think eventually he opens up to a very different point of view of how spirituality is developed within the church, and then unfortunately, it all ends, and we have no idea where it went. Nobody ever referred. There are very few references to the Book of Steps in later Syriac literature. Extremely few, and so it's hard to know what place it had in Syriac literature, except that we have this major work that has survived, and we're trying to put it a little more into center stage now. Thank you. I'm hoping in the next couple of lectures to deal with some of the other issues. But as we say, there's what you're really reading about is, let's just say the fellow lived 30, this is describing 30 years. You're just talking about incidents and so forth that happened in 30 different years. And so there's almost too much to try to keep track of. But I will try to point out some of the major things in the next lecture. And then the third one will deal with his ideas of spiritual counsel, of spiritual wisdom.
Any more questions? If not, Dr. Kitchen, thank you very much for this wonderful talk.
Well, thank you.
We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday, October 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you, all of you, for attending. I hope to see you again next week. Have a good day.
Thank you very much to all of you who do it. It's wonderful to be able to see lots of people. Of course, with this Zoom thing, you can only see a few at a time, and so where the different people are. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.